Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar for Energy Innovator Fellows and ORISE Fellows. Today's topic is stakeholder engagement. Before we get started, I invited Marty to talk about the decision about the Fellows Summit. Marty?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining today's webinar on stakeholder engagement. For those that don't know me, I'm Martin Sulik, or Marty. I'm the contractor with the Department of Energy on the Energy Innovator Fellowship program. So originally, as you may know, we scheduled time during this webinar to discuss the summit presentation guidelines. But as you may have seen, ORISE sent out an email earlier today to give an update on the summit. Unfortunately, due to some circumstances that are basically out of our control, we have had to make the regrettable decision to cancel this year's event. We apologize for this, and it just came down to not being able to get approvals in time, and with the planned dates of the summit in July, we just could not logistically get everything lined up in time. On a lighter note, however, everything else, if you're wondering, is moving forward. Renewals are being sent out. If you haven't received your renewal notice yet, you should receive it soon. And if you didn't see the message yesterday, the fellow application for the 2025 class open, please check your emails and do share as you can on your LinkedIn, other social media and networks and contacts. So I just wanted to provide that update because, like I said, there was time scheduled during this to discuss the summit, but obviously, since we have had to cancel the event, this webinar has been cut short by that last half hour, and today's will just be about the actual stakeholder engagement informational webinar itself. Back to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Oh, great. I just wanted to give an opportunity if anybody had any questions for Marty.
Yeah. And if you don't have any at this time, you're welcome to reach out either to the ORISE email, the DOE-RPP email, or even at eif@ee.doe.gov, the regular emails. We're more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Thanks, Marty.
Sure.
Well, let's get started with our webinar today. We've got a great topic, near and dear to my heart, stakeholder engagement. We have both Jasmine McAdams and Natalie Mims from Berkeley Lab to present. So you can feel free, like always, to enter your questions in the chat box at any time. Or if you want to ask your question live during Q&A, just use the raise hand function and we will call on you to unmute yourself. A little bit about our presenters. I know Jasmine because she used to work at the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners and providing technical assistance to commissions across the country. She's got a master's degree in energy and resources from the University of California here at Berkeley and a bachelor's in geology from Brown. Today, she is a graduate student research assistant at Berkeley Lab while she is earning her PhD at the university. And Natalie Mims is a deputy leader and an energy policy researcher at the lab. Her topics vary from large load growth like data centers, distribution system planning, energy affordability, and energy efficiency and distributed energy resource programs. She's got a strong background before she came to the lab, primarily working on demand-side management and energy efficiency programs. And she's got her master's in environmental law from Vermont Law School. I just want to remind you about future webinars coming up for fellows. The next one is going to be really great. It's on data visualization. So how do you take the data that's really important to your program and make it understandable and powerful for internal and external stakeholders? So everything from what data to select and how to present it graphically. We also are following that up with 2 more webinars in June. One on electric system reliability with JP Carballo from Berkeley Lab on June 17th. And then on July 24th, there's one on program planning and evaluation. So programs like electric vehicles or demand flexibility. You'll learn from Miles Collins, who's on this webinar, and Steve Schiller, both experts in benefit cost analysis and program planning and evaluation generally. And then we're still planning to hold a webinar probably in August on data centers. All our webinars start at 2 p.m. Eastern. All right, that's it for me. Now it's time for our presentation.
All right, I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. Can folks see the big screen with the stakeholder engagement slide?
I see it. It looks large enough to me, Miles.
Maybe I might not have shared the right.
If you, yeah, it's not quite full screen.
Gotcha. Let me see. All right.
I also have them pulled up if you need me
Okay.
to share my
I think it
screen
should
too.
work now. All right, can you see the agenda slide?
Yes, that's great.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so today we'll be talking about stakeholder engagement. I'll be starting off with a few more high-level kind of grounding slides, and I'll be passing it off to Natalie. But first, we're going to start with a short poll just to get a sense of what folks' kind of experience is around stakeholder engagement. And then we'll talk about what opportunities exist for creating robust stakeholder engagement, provide an overview of stakeholder engagement in utility decision-making, as well as some strategies, and then lead to some specific examples and practices for stakeholder engagement in distribution system planning. All right, Miles, do you mind launching that poll? Thank you. And so the first thing we want to do is just get a sense of how often you have engaged external stakeholders in your projects. And if you haven't, there's also the never choice as well that you can enter, but we'll give folks a minute to respond. And so far, it looks like folks have either rarely or occasionally engaged stakeholders in their projects, which is great. So a lot of this might be things you're already familiar with, but hopefully we'll still have great, thank you for sharing that, have a chance to cover some new material. Awesome. So we have about 45% have occasionally and about 36% regularly, and then 15% rarely. Awesome, thank you so much. I will stop sharing that. Move to the next slide. All right. So in order to talk about the opportunities, I think it's helpful to really think about what some of the challenges are to conducting stakeholder engagement, particularly in this kind of arena of energy. And one of the things is that in dealing with different stakeholders, we also have to deal with a lot of administrative and potentially technical complexity of regulatory processes. As you'll see later at the end of this presentation or towards the end, Natalie will be talking about or kind of touching on some of these as well. And then oftentimes within community engagement or stakeholder engagement spaces, one of the big concerns is that communities are not actually engaged until later stages of a policy or program's development. And so that means that there really isn't a lot of meaningful opportunity for these stakeholders to actually influence the direction of something, because oftentimes those designs or those planning considerations have been pretty baked into the process. And so it's really important for stakeholder engagement to be more than just something that's maybe a checkbox on paper, but something that actually allows folks to have a meaningful sway and input in a process, in a decision. And in addition to that, there's a lot of kind of discussion and work around potential inaccessibility of public engagement processes. And this can look like a wide array of things. For example, In some cases, maybe you have a public meeting, but perhaps the community that that public meeting is being hosted in has different language needs outside of just English. And so it's important for that to be taken into consideration. Also, meeting times are something that's important to think about, as not everybody really has the 9 to 5 time frame available, which is often when some of these meetings will take place. Something to think about in consideration of the communities that you're working with, as well as there might be things like certain holidays, time off, different scheduling considerations. And then transportation is also another challenge, especially if it's not a meeting that is going to be remotely held or in a hybrid format. It's important to think about where folks might be able to easily get to that location of a meeting, especially if it's not close to public transit. And then lastly, that's listed here, but certainly not the only thing or the last thing to really think about overall, is how to make these processes also accessible for folks with disabilities, whether those are kind of accommodations that could be made in person or even offline. So if you're thinking about more remote opportunities, that could be providing things like transcription services or ASL needs. So just want to put some of these challenges in here because they kind of come up time and time again. And myself, even working in this space for the last few years, I've seen this come up in real life application more than once. And so definitely want to try and mitigate that as much as possible. And so when we talk about creating robust and meaningful public participation opportunities, some of these are things I just touched on, but really that looks like enabling capacity building and collaboration with communities, encouraging a lot of different viewpoints, conducting careful planning and preparation to make sure you're accommodating all of these different things that we talked about earlier, creating accessible policies and practices, ensuring transparency and accountability mechanisms. And I think this one's really important when you're working with communities that maybe have historically not had maybe the strongest relationship with certain organizations, especially the accountability piece, to ensure that they feel that their input is actually meaningful and making a difference. And then lastly, you want to ensure that the practices are socially and culturally responsive. And so now I'm just going to talk about a few strategies. These are pretty high level, and I won't get into too much detail, but there are some more resources that I link to on each of the slides that should point you to more specific examples or templates if you're interested in learning more. Okay. So one of the first things that's really important for conducting stakeholder engagement is to establish a vision and a plan for that engagement. And I think that the first step of doing that is to really identify the boundaries of your engagement. And so if you look at this graphic that I have here, in the yellow circle, this shows the full universe of interests and concerns that might be important to various stakeholders. However, when you're thinking about the type of engagement that you might be trying to plan for your organization, this is going to be a lot smaller of kind of a universe or a world that you're going to have to scope out. And so it's really important to be clear about what the difference between these two things is. And I think even being in the kind of the energy space, it can be sometimes challenging because I think a lot of folks don't always have the most deep knowledge of this sector or kind of how regulation occurs. And so they might not really understand all of the different elements that are actually relevant to a particular regulator or an organization that might be kind of invested in this process. So just being really clear about that at the outset is really helpful. And then that can also help you identify specific engagement objectives. And those objectives, it's really helpful for those to be also tied to SMART goals, which I have here, you may have heard of as specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound targets that are also aligned with those objectives. In addition to that, where possible, it's also really great to look over and kind of review the objectives of other engagement processes that you might have going on concurrently. And I'll get to that a little bit more, but it's a way to really make sure that you are carrying both a consistent message and also limiting opportunities for something called engagement fatigue. And so these two resources that I posted here, the Inclusive Community Engagement Playbook and the Spectrum of Community Engagement to Ownership, I think are really great tools and frameworks to kind of use as a starting point for thinking about this vision and planning. And that second tool, and sorry for the blurriness here, the Spectrum of Community Engagement to Ownership, I think is such a great framework for thinking about whether there's certain types of activities or public engagement structures that you're thinking about are really appropriate for the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And the way that this framework really lays out this type of structure is that it thinks about the actual impact for the community and then sort of works down from there to think about what strategies would be appropriate. And so this goes along a spectrum that looks at this stance toward a community from marginalization all the way down to community ownership. And I think in the work that a lot of the fellows here are doing, I think it's great to sort of try and fall somewhere between the 3, 4, and 5. So involving, collaborating, and deferring to. And so that might look like doing more interactive, having more interactive forums like workshops, maybe community advisory councils or participatory action research approaches. And this just really ensures that the folks who are involved have a meaningful voice and a say and more of a collaborative kind of opportunity to work with the agencies that you'll be working with as well. Okay. And so in addition to that, when you're establishing a vision and a plan for engagement, as I said earlier, it's really helpful to sort of lay out your key objectives to the SMART targets. And then from there, it's great to outline what that stakeholder engagement plan is. And referencing complementary plans or resources can be really helpful to ensure consistency. It's great to identify and determine the timeline of your engagement and what's happening at each of those time markers, as well as to identify internal capacity and skills for implementation. And then this can help you determine whether additional training might be needed for staff, or if it might be helpful to even outsource or look for a third party to help facilitate different activities. And then lastly, it's great to determine the budget. Obviously, I think, we are in a day and age where maybe that is a little bit more important to consider. So keeping all of that in mind, I think is really helpful. And the other thing that, I think is a great recommendation, especially if you have the time or the resources to do this, is to consider how you might be able to actually make this a bit more of an iterative process or embed flexibility where you're taking into account sort of the feedback that you're getting from the stakeholders you're engaging. So if, for example, you have a series of workshops that you want to plan over a few months, and you're getting feedback early on that maybe folks aren't really enjoying the style of facilitation, or maybe they want to move the time a little bit, maybe it's too long or too short, it's great to sort of build in these opportunities for flexibility so that you can kind of improve the process and keep it as effective as possible for your stakeholders as you're moving through it. And here are some really great resources. I really think I would really highly recommend the Planning Your Engagement Efforts by Penn State. They have a really great website with a number of other resources that kind of walk through every single step of a stakeholder engagement process, not only the planning level. So some of the stuff I'll talk about later and throughout this have also pulled from this website. All right. Perhaps one of the most important things, in my opinion, around community and stakeholder engagement is to really ground efforts in the context of the community that you're showing up in. And so there are a lot of different ways that this can look, but some strategies that I have seen across the country and in different communities have been to collaborate with cultural brokers and community liaisons. And these are essentially folks who are have certain positions, paid positions, to really act as liaisons in their communities between agencies or organizations and the communities themselves, who are knowledgeable about kind of both sides, and they can kind of do that translation and help either recruit people or just kind of inform people about important updates. In addition to that, I think it's really great to take meetings in neutral spaces or on locations identified by stakeholders, if that's possible, really to help folks feel comfortable and also easily navigate to spaces that they are already familiar with. In addition to inviting stakeholders to your events, I think it's really good to also look for opportunities to go to their events as well and participate in initiatives that maybe community-based organizations or other nonprofits may be hosted. This is not only to help build relationships, but also to really show that you are invested in the interests of those communities and are looking to kind of facilitate a more longer-term partnership with a community. And then it's also helpful and really great to ensure that the engagement is culturally and linguistically relevant. And that's something that I think that the cultural brokers or the community liaisons can help do. But also hiring interpreters and translators is another great step. In the middle here, I've posted just a few principles that the city of Eugene, Oregon put together on how to kind of enter a community and what that looks like, especially if you're not someone who comes from that community or super familiar with them. And so some of those principles includes really beginning where folks are and respecting their value system and kind of doing your homework to identify what that is beforehand. This also involves making broad contact, not just folks at the top level, and ensuring that you've had some sort of opportunity to touch base kind of across the system. And then another example of that is trying to resist coming off as just being an expert, because you're also there to learn about the community. We're not all experts of the communities that we do work in. We may be experts in certain topic areas, but that doesn't mean that we always know exactly what is the best solution for a community. So just keeping that in mind is really helpful. Another way to sort of learn about the communities is to map and analyze stakeholders. And there are a lot of different ways to do this activity, stakeholder mapping. And that can include simple things such as just stakeholder databases where you put together a spreadsheet and kind of categorize folks appropriately. You can also do power analyses, which involves thinking about the different power dimensions that might be involved and where stakeholders are situated and some of the interests that they might have. And social network analyses is a way to look at all the different ways that stakeholders might be related to each other and kind of get a sense of who's talking to each other and who might not be talking to each other. And then this graphic that I have up here shows an example of an interest and influence matrix, which is one of my favorite kind of tools for stakeholder mapping, where you can essentially place on an XY axis where every stakeholder group or individual may be kind of situated, both along an axis of power and influence, as well as need and interest to your particular engagement or decision. All right, moving on to actually designing the engagement. So this refers to the specific activities or kind of forums that you may be creating to actually kind of elicit information and feedback from stakeholders. And there are a lot of different tools that are available to use. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I just wanted to point to some places that can kind of walk through the different pros and cons of those approaches, how many different types of skills you might need, or the amount of resources or time that it might take to actually do some of these things. And so this over here is a great table by the Inclusive Community Engagement Playbook by C40 Cities that shares and walks through each of these different tool types and kind of provides a high level kind of summary of what the time, skills, and resource needs will be for each one. But these resources down here below in this box also, I think, provide a really good overview of other strategies that can be employed. And this, I think, is great to sort of think about in the context of the cultural needs of a community, especially if you're thinking about going into communities that have really established ways of doing decision making, and getting a sense of that ahead of time is a great way to sort of facilitate more effective engagement. All right, so I hinted at this a little bit earlier, and essentially what we're concerned about here is how we can design engagement in a way that limits fatigue. We're in an era of, I think, a lot of Zoom meetings and need to constantly be engaged with other folks to talk through different things. And I think that is not an isolated thing to just the folks who are in this room, but also for the communities that we will be potentially working with. And there are a lot of ways that we can think about limiting that fatigue. As I mentioned earlier, one way is to sort of gather stakeholder feedback on an engagement plan or process throughout the process. And so that is one way to sort of think about kind of stopping it before it actually gets to the point of reaching fatigue. Another way to limit fatigue is to identify events or initiatives that may overlap with your engagement process, and maybe coordinating with other teams to see where you might actually be able to just kind of work together on one event rather than hosting two events where folks might be providing the same type of information. This might also involve kind of going more externally outside your organization, and so could require some earlier and advanced planning. And then in addition to that, and related to that, is the need to collect and synthesize insights from other initiatives and public engagements. So even if you can't collaborate, I think there is still a lot of useful information that can be gathered from these other forums that can be used to provide input into these initiatives that you may be working on. And then if you're planning a workshop or a meeting, usually it's best practice to present the complex issues a bit earlier on in the agenda, especially earlier in the day before folks get really tired. So if you're getting into some of the more complicated rate making things, and I think having that up front can be really helpful. And then, of course, it's great to have a lot of breaks and refreshments for folks to keep them energized. Okay, so I will briefly stop here to see if there are any questions folks have either about the slides or about public engagement generally. And if not, I'll pass it on to Natalie.
Hi, anybody can raise their hand and we can call on you, and you can unmute yourself. Also, because I don't see any questions in the chat, and you can enter them right now in the chat if you'd like. I'm gonna stall by asking you a question.
Yes, go for it.
You noted where folks might want to be on the stakeholder collaboration spectrum, like on the, more on the right side. But where do you think, your experience in the past has been with public utility commissions. Where do you think folks are right now at public utility commissions? And I know it varies.
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, I think in my experience, I feel like we sort of fall more in the consult, involve, and maybe a little bit in the collaborate phase. But I think that a lot of the ways that folks can get involved publicly in these commissions is through things like public comment. And so that's one way that we're seeing that consult fall in there. And then interactive workshops, I'm seeing more and more examples of that. For example, in Michigan, with around some of their kind of climate plan and grid planning and grid modernization planning, they had a series of different interactive workshops that I think involved a lot more of the community, and at least gave the opportunity for communities to get involved. And then there's a little bit, I've seen some examples as well of citizen advisory committees or more robust types of planning, but not as much, I think, as the sort of 2 and 3.
All right, great. Any other questions? We can also take questions after Natalie's presentation. Natalie's going to actually show you sort of an application of some of these stakeholder engagement principles, practices. All right,
Thanks.
Natalie.
Thanks, Lisa.
We will-
So, as Lisa said,
Ooh,
I'm
it
going to,
looks like we had a question from Steve.
oh,
Yeah, I'll be quick. Do you have any good examples of, I'm thinking of it from the Public Utilities Commission side, but ongoing engagement efforts that are not just one-off specific projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know if this, this counts as maybe ongoing to an extent, but I think seeing different states that have stakeholder or intervenor compensation, which is a type of compensation that allows more non-traditional parties to intervene in public utility commission proceedings. And so that's essentially funding that maybe is like reimbursed or provided upfront. And some states, some state commissions have that as kind of on an ongoing basis and can apply for that through a different kind of range of different proceedings. So that might be one example, but I'm curious if Natalie might have another example of an ongoing engagement.
yeah, the one that I usually point to is in Oregon, where the commission staff and the utilities have pretty ongoing, consistent stakeholder engagement for the integrated resource plan. And I believe also for the distribution system plan. So the utility will have, education focused or analysis or plan focused meetings as they lead up to filing the IRP or the distribution system plan. And afterwards, they may have more general information talking about the performance of the plan, but, keeping it in this full cycle of, letting people know about what's in the plan, how things have been performing, and not having it necessarily stop and start and be pretty continuous. Lisa, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add to that. I'm going to take your
Yeah,
chats as a no.
No, I just posted in the chat a couple things. One, reflecting Jasmine's comment about non-traditional stakeholders getting involved because they actually have funding to do so. And so that's the legislation in Oregon. That's the first link I posted. The second one is to the integrated distribution system plans. And then I can also post one on the integrated resource plans, which have been going on in Oregon since 1989. And that's stakeholder engagement. It's really the hallmark, I think, of an effective planning process. There's a question from Sai. How do you recommend getting buy-in for some of these strategies and best practices within our respective offices as fellows?
That's a great question. I think that getting buy-in can be really great to do if you tie it back to the original sort of mission or kind of purpose of that office that you're working with, and sort of finding alignment between that mission and then some of the stakeholder engagement principles. And I also think that stakeholder engagement is very flexible and really essentially is a way to, you can reframe it as an opportunity to really make sure that you're having and looking out for the public's best interest. And so in order to get that buy-in, I think tying that back to that public interest is really powerful. And another thing to consider is, what are we missing out on if we don't do these approaches? And I think, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, there are some examples where communities have been involved too late. And when that happens, it can actually raise costs or just extend the decision-making timeline, because a community comes back and is like, hey, this is not something we are aware of. We don't want this. Could even lead to like legal disputes. And so I think to mitigate that risk, really doing this robust engagement as early as possible to ensure buy-in from a community so that you don't meet resistance later is kind of a great way to think about it as well.
Thanks, Jasmine. Those were great answers. I think building on what you said about finding the, tying the stakeholder engagement to the goals, thinking about the priorities for your particular state, whether it's affordability or reliability or some other action. And one other idea is focusing your stakeholder engagement around those topics and bringing people in to try and amplify, the messages that are of interest to your commission as well. So it's kind of bringing them together so it's not just a tangential item, but it's core to what is helping the commission to achieve their goals. So I'm going to talk about a specific example of stakeholder engagement in distribution system planning. I'm going to focus on state requirements around stakeholder engagement in distribution system planning. And if you have more questions for Jasmine, we should have time at the end of the session. So feel free to put them in the chat, or you can ask her when I get done talking as well. So as this slide shows, there's 13 different states that explicitly require stakeholder engagement as part of their distribution system plan. And that's what's shown in the first bullet. And the majority of these states require that utilities share information with stakeholders and provide an opportunity for feedback prior to when the distribution system plan is filed. And so that kind of speaks to Jasmine's point about bringing the communities in early enough to make sure that they're engaged and can influence the outcome. Some of the common requirements are specifying the minimum number of stakeholder meetings that the utility must hold prior to the plan, or requiring certain topics to be discussed, depending on what the priorities are at that time, and establishing working groups. And the PUCs may also hold informal workshops as part of the distribution system plan and as part of the stakeholder engagement process as well. So for the rest of my presentation, I'm going to more or less focus on this little graphic that's on the right side of the slide. And it talks about the different points of stakeholder engagement and distribution system planning. And the 4 points are before the plan's filed, requiring reporting on the stakeholder engagement that occurred within the filed plan, providing information about your stakeholder engagement or holding meetings after the plan is filed, and then also in orders discussing the future distribution system planning requirements and utility requirements. So I'll walk through each one of those. Before I even get to that, though, I wanted to step back and say, as with other regulatory proceedings, the PUC can also engage stakeholders when they're developing their distribution system planning requirements. And usually that's a PUC-led effort in states. And in other states, the utilities or the PUC might direct the utilities to propose a process for this. So this example on this slide is from Oregon. This is from when they were developing their DSP guidance, their first round of guidance. And the red box on this chart show the different points of stakeholder engagement as the PUC was developing that distribution system planning guidance. So there was, oh, they're blue boxes, sorry. It includes feedback on the PUC staff proposals on the distribution system plan drivers and outcomes, phases, goals, deliverables, workshops. There's comments on workshops, and then there's stakeholder engagement after the utility filed their first plan in response to the guidance. And then it's followed by a memo from the staff on the final recommendation. So there was a lot of opportunities for engagement in this particular process. And I guess this isn't really speaking to the ongoing process aspect that we talked about from Sai's question, but there's several states that are working on their IDSP guidance right now. I think Connecticut and Maryland are two of them that come to mind for me, and they've been holding lots of stakeholder engagement over multiple years as they're developing these rules, and keeping the different variety of stakeholders that are interested in the distribution system planning engaged throughout that entire process. So moving forward again to just focusing on stakeholder engagement. So the top circle that I talked about was stakeholder engagement that's required prior to filing a distribution system plan. And this is the most common requirement that we've seen from states to utilities. And there's 9 states that require the regulated utilities to engage stakeholders prior to filing their distribution system plans. And the example that I have shown on this slide is from New York, and this is from when the PSC, the Public Service Commission, adopted their distribution system implementation plan guidance in 2016. And as part of that order, they directed the utility to file a plan and a timeline for stakeholder engagement during the development of their first plan. And this graphic shows the proposed stakeholder engagement strategy that was filed by the joint utilities. And they launched a website to help ensure that everyone that was interested knew the one-stop shopping place for all information on the distribution system implementation plan activities and related topics. And they include an advisory group and an engagement group and a technical conference as part of their stakeholder engagement framework. Some other examples in Illinois, they had a requirement that states that the utilities hold at least 6 stakeholder engagement meetings prior to filing their multi-year integrated grid plan. And they had specific topics that needed to be discussed. The agenda went out in advance of the meetings, and people could submit questions to the utilities in advance of those meetings, and they had an independent facilitator. So it was pretty robust stakeholder engagement there. And then the commission actually sent that plan back for revision, and the utilities had stakeholder engagement as they went through refining and revising their plan, which they ultimately filed and was approved earlier this year. So moving to that second circle, reporting on stakeholder engagement, PUCs can require this. The examples I have here, in Colorado, the utilities have to include a description of their stakeholder engagement process. In New York, in their 2023 distribution system implementation plan guidance, staff recommended that the utilities include information on stakeholder engagement for each one of the topical sections of their plan. And there's like 15 different topical sections, so it's a lot. And, forecasting, electric vehicles, efficiency, etc. And what National Grid did when they were in their plan in response to this, they included information about their stakeholder interface for each one of the topical sections. And so, for example, for forecasting, the stakeholder interface is that the utility put the forecasted load profiles per feeder, and they published them on the utility's data portal. So this is an example of how the utility was providing information to stakeholders as part of their stakeholder engagement strategy. But they weren't necessarily having meetings around that specific topic. So I thought that was kind of an interesting way to go about sharing information. In Illinois, the independent facilitator, as part of the multi-year integrated grid plan, files a report to the commission on the stakeholder discussions, as well as the areas of consensus and disagreement. In Rhode Island, the least cost procurement plans, where the utilities are considering their non-wires alternative projects, which are typically part of distribution system plans. They have to include the minutes of public meetings and the presentations that were made at the energy efficiency meetings. Oregon requires the utilities to prepare a community engagement plan for their distribution system plans. And those plans describe the actions the utility will implement to engage communities when they're developing their non-wires alternative proposals. And so the plan has to include documentation of the stakeholder comments, as well as the utility's response to those comments, and also comment on what was not implemented that was suggested by the stakeholders. So really holding the utilities accountable for stakeholder engagement. And in Portland General Electric in Oregon's, their most recent distribution system plan, they included all of the questions and all of the responses to those questions from stakeholders, and they were submitted. All of the questions that were submitted as part of the workshops that led up to the filing of the plan were included in the plan, as well as the utility's response to those questions. So the next one is commissions can require stakeholder engagement after the distribution system plan is filed, and this is much less common. So I have a couple examples here. In California, the Distribution Planning Advisory Group advises the utility on the selection of non-wires alternative projects after the plan is filed, and provides input on the development of the competitive solicitations to acquire those resources. In Minnesota, the staff can determine if additional stakeholder meetings are needed. Oregon holds ongoing technical workshops, which we talked about. And then in Maryland, recently, the commission accepted a working group recommendation around the distribution system plan guidance that they're developing, that after the utility files their plan and hold a workshop explaining the results, the utility's response to stakeholder feedback has to be published on the utility website, including the proposals that were made and which, what was and was not evaluated. So again, creating some accountability there. So stakeholder engagement is evolving. Distribution system planning is starting to become more popular, or publicly required and available distribution system planning is starting to become more prominent in the United States. We have about 22 states, I think, that have distribution system planning requirements. And as these states go through their iterations of distribution system planning, stakeholder engagement evolves with those processes. And so, for example, in Nevada, the PUC provided guidance on stakeholder engagement in their 2022 distributed resource plan, and then again on the update to the distributed resource plan. And most recently, they required the utilities to collaborate with stakeholders on locational net benefits and non-wires alternatives related to the updated plan. And in Michigan, this is the graphic that's shown on the right side of the slide. DTE created a reliability improvement map, and that was in response to stakeholder feedback that there was a lack of visible upgrades and maintenance in areas in certain parts of their service territory. And so they created this map to try and make it more transparent about where improvements were being made. In the order at the end of 2024 in Illinois, when the commission required ComEd to refile their multi-year integrated grid plan, they directed the utility to engage in continued stakeholder workshops with a focus on identifying customers in need of assistance, disconnection practices, and data collection and reporting. One other example I have is from Minnesota. This really illustrates the commission's desire to have ongoing improvement in stakeholder engagement as part of their integrated distribution system planning process. So in 2021, the commission required Xcel Energy to hold at least 4 stakeholder meetings to collaborate with interested parties, obtain input, and generate new ideas around a shared vision of the distribution grid of the future, and file a summary of that process. And that was, they had to file that prior to their 2023 integrated distribution plan. And then in their ruling in 2023, the commission required Xcel to undertake 3 different stakeholder engagement tasks. And so this kind of shows the evolution of the commission adding additional specificity as to what they would like to see. So first, they wanted to host stakeholder engagement discussions on cost-benefit analysis approaches, and include a discussion of those conversations in their next filed plan, in the utility's next filed plan. And then they had to collaborate with stakeholders to refine planned net load methodology and to evaluate alternative net load approaches with stakeholders and report on those results. And then finally, to conduct stakeholder outreach specifically with DER owners and operators, and describe in the filing the stakeholder engagement process and materials that are used to inform stakeholders of the utility's distributed energy resource management system. And so, this is very specific guidance and the commission, is trying to point out that getting input from audiences that are going to need to benefit from this system would be useful as the utility considers making these large investments in their infrastructure and communication. My last example is from Massachusetts, and this is focuses kind of on a state energy office role. So they have the Grid Mod Advisory Council in Massachusetts that's led by the State Energy Office, and they're responsible for reviewing and providing feedback on the utility's electric sector modernization plans. And the council provided 88 formal recommendations on the utility's grid mod plans and or electric sector modernization plans. And some of the examples of stakeholder engagement recommendations that they provided were that they're shown at the top of the slide, but it was, developing goals and clear reporting metrics to measure the efficacy of proposed stakeholder engagement. So the comments were really some of the comments were focused on, more meetings doesn't necessarily equal better product. And so like, how can you actively and effectively engage stakeholders, and how could you measure that and show that you aren't just going through the motions? The utilities responded to all of the recommendations in their initial filings, and the DPU, the regulator in Massachusetts, found that the utilities complied with their stakeholder engagement requirements and noted in their order that was approving the plans that they expected the company to make the appropriate efforts to invite stakeholder feedback in the electric sector modernization plan approach. So that takes me to the end of my slides, and I'm happy to take questions. And Jasmine is also available to take additional questions if anybody would like.
Great, thanks, Natalie. We've got a couple of comments with a question in the chat. So in the regulatory space, I find two major challenges around stakeholder engagement. First, in some states, public comment doesn't enter the evidentiary record and thus is not meaningful engagement. Second, stakeholder participation is usually limited to those that can navigate the technical aspects of things like distribution system planning. What would you identify as the optimal opportunities in the regulatory space to involve interested consumers in a meaningful way?
Sure, I can take a stab at this, and then Jasmine, you can certainly weigh in if you have additional thoughts. So in terms of public comment not entering the record, I mentioned this a couple of times, but requiring the utilities to record what stakeholder engagement they performed, what questions were asked, how they responded to it, or really any information that requires the utility to be accountable for stakeholders showing up and participating in the process is probably the best way to deal with that. It likely will require the commission to tell the utility to do that. So it's not necessarily something that can be done without commission action, unless the utility is feeling very like they want to contribute information that's not required. But yeah, really trying to find ways that the utility has to respond, and making stakeholders feel like they've been heard and they're not just, shouting into a black hole is pretty important. Not only so that stakeholders continue to stay engaged, but so that other people can see what happened at these meetings and see what kind of information is being shared and what ideas that the stakeholders are coming up with. And then in terms of participation limited to those that can navigate the technical aspects, I think that there's a couple of approaches. The first one is around what Jasmine mentioned around intervener compensation. This can provide an opportunity for someone who wouldn't otherwise be able to engage in this to receive compensation and be paid to participate in the docket. So they might have more time to learn about these topics and dig in a little bit more. The other one is that some utilities have general stakeholder engagement meetings where they present information that's a little bit at a higher level and kind of roll up and focus on the big takeaways or the executive summary of their plans, or just the higher level data points that they want to share. And I think that that can be a nice way to start to bring people into the conversation and help them learn about electric system planning and think about, where they could engage on topics that they're interested in. I think it's important to keep all of the meetings open to all of the stakeholders. The utilities can also have really specific meetings where they tell people we're going to focus on hosting capacity analysis. And if you don't want to dig in deep on this, that might not be the meeting for you to attend. However, we'll have the notes and the slides available for other people to review as well. So those are some ideas that I have. Jasmine, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, I can share one example from California. So the California Public Utilities Commission in I think 2022 or 2023 created this program which essentially provided grants to organizations that could then take the money and use that to educate folks in California, particularly folks from underserved communities, about kind of CPUC related matters. And so I think that that type of model I think in California is the first one I've seen, but essentially encouraging CPUC education and doing so in a way that kind of utilizes pre-existing sort of frameworks or networks. And I can drop the link. So that's one example of that I've seen that I think is really great. And then this isn't quite driven by the commissions themselves, but this one organization called Community Voices in Energy has been doing work kind of on the outreach side of things to try and get more folks to get engaged in CPUC matters, and they have put together a number of different trainings. And so those might be able to be used by CPUCs to kind of give 101 information on commission matters as well.
Great. Any other questions or comments for Jasmine or Natalie?
I guess one other thing that we should have mentioned is that the PUC staff can hold educational meetings as well and share, information on planning and the, participating in regulatory proceedings, et cetera. And that certainly would be a way to help bring people into the fold and up to speed on different challenges and ongoing issues in the planning space.
Any other questions or comments? You can raise your hand. You can put a question in the chat. All right. Well, thanks to Jasmine and Natalie for a great presentation today. The recording will be available soon at the link that I posted at the top of the meeting. I will post it one more time before we sign off. So for folks who joined late, you can see it. All right. Thanks, and hopefully we'll see you soon. We have a couple of webinars in June coming up. And then we have it was continuing July and August. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.